Chapter 15. The Republic. The final act in this great drama is now performed. The Republic of Texas is no more. Dr. Ensign Jones, President of Texas, February 19, 1846. The Republic of Texas was supposed to be ephemeral. The people of Texas voted overwhelming approval of union with the United States on the same ballot by which they elected the Republic's officers. The people of Texas had cultural, economic, political, and military reasons for seeking annexation, and obviously the United States had a tremendous strategic stake in Texas. Texas blocked American expansion to the Pacific, and a weak, unstable nation on American borders invited penetration by still ambitious European powers. The Monroe Doctrine could not by any stretch of the imagination keep British influence out if Britain chose to fish in Texas waters. Sam Houston's Republic was a straggling frontier community of less than 40,000 people. It was a series of plantations and farms carved out of the southern forests along the river bottoms extending up from the Gulf, with an utterly colonial economy. Most Texans were subsistence farmers, with a little barter on the side. The planters exported their cotton against imported goods. The balance of trade was as yet adverse. The largest towns were frontier outposts with mud streets and at most a few thousand assorted people. There was no money economy, nor any money. There were no banks or improved roads or organized schools. There was no industry. Everything from pins to powder had to be imported from the United States. Over this sprawling community, the government was only loosely organized. The Texans replaced the old ayuntamientos with governmental units they considered more comfortable, counties. But real government consisted primarily of sheriffs and justices of the peace. Texas barely approached the basic requirements for statehood. It would take more than the accumulated political experience of a handful of capable men and the traditions of the English-speaking peoples to make it a viable, sovereign nation. The Lone Star flag flew proudly and perilously over Texas for 10 years, but not through Texans' choice. The problem was the political situation that had developed within the past half-dozen years inside the United States. President Adams had been prepared to buy Texas in the 1820s, and Jackson sent his first minister to Mexico, Anthony Butler, with an obvious interest in obtaining the region. But by the middle 1830s, Monroe's old worry that further expansion of the nation westward might threaten its very existence was proving ominously true. Suddenly, the question of annexation of Texas became inseparably linked with the whole question of Negro slavery in the United States. On May 25, 1836, shortly after the news of San Jacinto was celebrated in Washington, and when petitions and resolutions to recognize Texan independence were pouring into Congress, John Quincy Adams suddenly denounced the Texas Revolution on the floor of the House. He stated the whole purpose of the revolution and ensuing war was the reestablishment of slavery in territory where it had already been abolished through Mexican law, and attacked the president bitterly for sending General Gaines to the border in defense of slavery. It was quite true that the southern states wanted the entry of Texas to strengthen their minority in Congress vis-a-vis national affairs, and the northern states desired to prevent any such reinforcement. But to let the whole question of the acquisition of an immense western territory turn on such a matter was, in retrospect, a very parochial view. It was one that Westerners like Houston and Jackson could hardly comprehend. They had very little ideology. They tended to see slavery as an economic problem, but above all, they believed in the expansion of the territory and power of their own race, and trusted it to find its moral solutions in good time. Houston and Jackson almost equally despised Northern abolitionists and Southern nullifiers. Both threatened the Greater Union. From the language they used, it appears that in 1836, Westerners, Southerners, and Northerners all had different concepts of what the American Union was all about. The problem transcended slavery, but slavery became the common emotional tool. The Old South, where in 1820 the only anti-slavery societies in the country existed, began to defend what was a moral liability no one liked very much with incredible intransigence. The Northern abolitionists gradually begun to mount an attack on the institution of slavery that could not be supported under the existing framework of the Union. Adams's speech attacking Texas showed everyone, including the president, that annexation had become political dynamite. It was uproariously supported by most of the Northern press and by Northern opinion generally. In the North, not only the Missouri Compromise, but the idea of compromise itself was almost dead. One hope in the Old South, and great fear in the North, was that Texas would open a great band of slave expansion through the Southwest. This opinion revealed an utter ignorance of geography. Climate itself and the Great Plains made any such expansion of the Cotton Kingdom impossible. With Anglo-Texas along the Brazos, chattel slavery had reached its natural geographic limits in the United States. While Texan agents lobbied for recognition and continued to press their resolution for annexation, the matter was deferred for the elections of 1836. Van Buren was Jackson's man, but he was elected by such a small majority that the lame duck president was hamstrung. Jackson still wanted to recognize Texas, but Van Buren's friends argued now that any such move would damage Van Buren's administration before it began. The hope of immediate annexation of Texas was completely gone after Adams' stand. The distinguished Massachusetts congressman spoke against Texas almost every day of the summer of 1836, and even the question of recognition of Texas's independence was very much in doubt. Jackson's agent in Texas, Henry Morfitt, sounded the local situation out in August and September 1836. Morfitt reported back that Texas's best hope of continued independence lay in the stupidity of the rulers of Mexico and the financial embarrassment of the Mexican government. Morfitt was not impressed with Texas's prospects otherwise and advised the president to go slow. Jackson's Secretary of State, John Forsyth, was disturbed because Texas's referendum for annexation seemed to put the United States in a bad light. The quick vote for annexation seemed to show the whole revolution had been part of an expansionist plot. Forsyth advised Jackson not to recognize Texas until Great Britain or some other major power did so first. Under these circumstances, Jackson's message to Congress in December 1836 was cool toward Texas and proposed a delay in recognition. This dismayed the Texas government, just as it must have puzzled the Mexicans, who did not understand the terrible split in opinion within the United States. Relations with Mexico were badly strained. The Mexican minister, Eduardo de Gorostiza, circulated a paper condemning Jackson for dispatching General Gaines to the Sabine. This pamphlet both broke diplomatic courtesy and angered Jackson. Gorostiza picked up his credentials and went home, but the Mexican government supported his stand. However, there was no danger of a real war with Mexico at this time. The government was in collapse, the treasury was bankrupt, and the nation was impotent. The United States had nothing to fear from Mexican anger, but this was not clearly seen in some Washington quarters. Hoping to break the diplomatic impasse, Houston and Stephen Austin decided to send Santa Anna to Washington. The Mexican dictator himself had come up with a long-visioned plan by which the United States and Mexico would establish a new border on the Rio Grande. In return for a cash payment, the United States would be free to annex Texas. This plan, which was denounced both in Mexico and the United States, had enormous merit for both countries. It might have avoided another war. But Santa Anna had no real powers now to negotiate, which Jackson knew, and further, Jackson was in no position politically to absorb Texas. The capitals of both nations, in 1836 and 37, singularly lacked historical vision. Santa Anna arrived in Washington on January 17, 1837. He was received courteously, spent 6 fruitless days in discussions, and then sailed from Norfolk for Vera Cruz. Jackson offered to entertain the Mexicans' offer to sell Texas provided it came through regular diplomatic channels, which was impossible, and he also tried to include California in the deal. Santa Anna departed owing some $2,000 in expenses, which the Texas government eventually reimbursed. On April 19, 1837, Anastasio Bustamante again became president of Mexico, assuring a new hard line. Any hope of continued negotiations died here. Santa Anna, discredited by his defeat in Texas, retired to Jalapa to await a better day. The Texans in Washington swallowed their frustration and tried to keep in Jackson's favor. Jackson refused to put direct pressure on Congress to recognize Texas. His term was running out, and he had little real power. But from the sidelines, Jackson kept up a devious game. Earlier, Stephen Austin wrote to a Washington correspondent that if the United States was not prepared to extend aid and recognition, Texas might have to look elsewhere. Jackson turned this letter over to the Congress with a notation that further stalling might alienate Texas forever. Austin and Sam Houston were to find this argument the most effective one they had, both in securing recognition and eventual annexation. Neither Austin nor Houston had any desire to become involved with Britain, quite the opposite, but only the threat of concessions to Great Britain and the specter of a new British colony in the middle of America seemed to have any effect on the anti-expansionist Northeast. Houston continued the policy after Austin's death. A resolution to recognize Texas floundered in both the Senate and the House for months. Representative Waddy Thompson of South Carolina and Senator Robert J. Walker of Mississippi labored to pass the measure, which had been tabled as late as February 26, 1837, by a House vote of 98 to 86. The resolution was watered down in the House version. It now merely provided money for the sending of a diplomatic agent to Texas whenever the President of the United States may receive satisfactory evidence that Texas is an independent power and shall deem it expedient to appoint such a minister. The original words, "the Independent Republic of Texas," were stricken out. The measure was a wonderful example of American euphemism and political compromise, to say nothing of passing the buck. Even then, it passed the House only because most members either thought it would die in the Senate or be implemented at the discretion of Martin Van Buren, who was neutral and would do nothing. Pacifying the Texas lobby with what was considered a cheap vote, many House members lukewarm to Texas voted for it. It carried 121 to 76. Through some dazzling political footwork, Walker added the Texas resolution to a general civil appropriation bill before the Senate on March 2nd. This rider survived an attempt to knock it out 24 to 24. This Senate action sent the bill to the President for signature on Friday, March 3rd, less than 24 hours before he left office. Jackson signed it. Then he drafted a message to the Senate. He wrote he now deemed it proper and expedient to acknowledge the independence of Texas, and he nominated Alcée Labranche of Louisiana to be chargé d'affaires to Texas. Jackson finished this message late on the evening of March 3rd. Thus, not with a flourish, but with neat footwork, was history made. Jackson requested the Texan agents to come to the White House for the pleasure of a glass of wine. At midnight, the President of the United States raised his glass. "Gentlemen, the Republic of Texas." The Texans, William Wharton and Mamukin Hunt, drank to that. Jackson had another toast. "The President of the Republic of Texas." Jackson was a frontiersman. He never forgot a friend. It is perhaps significant and revealing that President Jackson, King Andrew, spent his last hours in office talking about Texas and reminiscing about one of his boys who had beaten it back and made good. Jackson capped his career in the White House by recognizing Texas. Banks and gentry and current ideology might come and go. Nullifiers and abolitionists, with all their accursed quarreling kind, fade into dust. The land was wide and went on forever, and Jackson's America was still pointed toward the Western Sea. The news of U.S. recognition caused celebrations throughout Texas, but it left Sam Houston with all his enormous problems intact. The first and most pressing was not the still existent state of war with Mexico, but the Texas Standing Army, now completely composed of a horde of ill-fed and intractable American volunteers. The Army had rejected Mirabeau Lamar. When Lamar resigned his commission to become vice president, the Army chose Felix Huston as its chief. Huston was a military adventurer of the old filibuster stripe. To get rid of him, Sam Houston appointed a capable new officer, Albert Sidney Johnston, to the Supreme Command. Felix Huston not only refused to go, but he seriously wounded Johnston in a trumped-up duel. Then, Huston went off to Columbia to lobby in the Texas Congress for his bright new plan, a march on Matamoros, Mexico. Now, Sam Houston was aided by American experience and tradition. He solved his Army problem the same way George Washington did, 2 generations before. While Huston was away, the president furloughed the Army with the exception of some 600 men. He could not discharge it because he could not meet the arrears in pay. But he gave all the men a furlough and never bothered to call them back. This may have exposed Texas to Mexican danger, but it effectively got rid of the threat of military dictatorship, as Huston's clamoring army faded away. The Lone Star State was sovereign, but Houston found it $1,250,000 in debt. The financial figures for the revolution may have seemed more those of a corporate business than an emerging nation, but the money trouble was serious. Houston was able to feed his rump army now only by personally signing government notes. Henry Smith, the Texas Secretary of the Treasury, was in an incredible position. He could not perform his duties because he had no official stationery, and there was no money in the Treasury to buy any. Most local officials were being paid in kind, and the proliferation of offices required now by a new national government strained the resources of 23 counties beyond endurance. The fact that many officers served out of patriotism without pay has sometimes been overlooked. Houston, with the vote for annexation of September 1836, considered his mandate called for him to damp the war with Mexico, avoid Indian trouble on the frontier, and try to get Texas into the United States. These aims, and his finances, required him to follow a quiet, conservative policy. Texas formally claimed the Rio Grande as its southern boundary in 1836, and this meant no hope of a settlement with Mexico. Historically, the Mexican counterclaim of the Nueces as the Texas boundary was correct. The Nueces, not the Rio Grande, had been the boundary between the province of Texas and the Mexican state of Tamaulipas, formerly Nuevo Santander. No Anglo-Texans lived south of the Nueces, but for that matter, only a few Mexicans lived north of the Rio Grande. The land was empty. The only real merit to the Texans' claim was that the Rio Grande was a much better defined boundary than the tiny Nueces, which looped up into Comanche country northwest of Behar and dribbled out. But despite that, they held it vehemently and were not likely to give it up. Many intelligent Mexicans saw that Anglo-Texas was now an undigestible nut and gone forever, but the claim for the Rio Bravo put national honor to new strains. Mexico refused to recognize Texan independence, and a formal state of war went on, although for some years there was no fighting. This state of war held back Texan settlement at Goliad and Refugio, and even San Antonio remained outside the normal Anglo-Texan sphere. Texas ruled the settlement at San Antonio, but few Anglo-Texans lived there. There was only a tiny garrison, and now and then a Texas magistrate arrived. White settlers, after 1836, were rapidly spreading up the Brazos and Colorado, and a steady stream of immigration was demolishing the wilderness across the northern part of the country. This movement was impinging on the settled Texas Indians, the remnants of the Caddoans, now a border tribe, the Wichitas, Tonkawas, and the Cherokees, Kickapoos, and others who had been pushed into Texas by being driven out of the United States. The Cherokees, a powerful tribe, were particularly restless and frightened. They had been pushed all the way from the mountains of Carolina and Tennessee, and now they, a forest and mountain people, were up against the Great Plains with nowhere to go. Whites were chopping the woods down and building cabins on the edges of their last refuge. Mexican agents went among them, talking war against the hated Americans. Houston was worried about this imminent Indian war. He submitted a bill that would have guaranteed the Cherokees title to their Texas lands. The Texas Congress angrily rejected it, but Houston, keeping state forces out of Indian country, was able to avert a serious war. The Kickapoos, aided by some Mexicans, took the warpath in the summer of 1838 under a Mexican agent, Vicente Cordova. Tom Rusk stamped this rebellion out with a force of hastily raised volunteers, while the Cherokees held aloof. The Cherokees' self-restraint did them no good. Although they were a remarkably peaceful and civilized tribe of Amerinds, in Texans' minds they were merely marauding red men, standing in the way of rightful Anglo-American progress. Houston, who had lived among Cherokees, wanted to protect them, but rather sadly, he knew the Indians' days were numbered. All he could do was hold off bloodshed so long as he was president. Despite Houston's innate conservatism, the government went further and further in debt. Houston was forced to spend some $2 million, and revenues in no way matched this. Texas's only productive tax was a tariff ranging from 1% on bread and flour to 50% on luxuries like silk. Such levies as tonnage fees, the poll tax, business taxes, and license or land fees raised only small amounts. The direct property tax was virtually uncollectible. Texans did not like taxes. Even much of the taxes or fees collected were returned as audited drafts or canceled claims against the government, so Henry Smith's treasury stayed bare. The only substantial money that arrived was a loan of $457,380 from the Bank of the United States in Pennsylvania. Efforts to borrow the $5 million Houston needed were fruitless. In the end, Houston did what every government in such a situation did, although everyone knew the solution's inherent folly. The government of Texas, in 1837, started printing paper money in the form of promissory notes. At first, these notes held their value very well, but with the second issue, in 1838, they depreciated to about 70 cents on the dollar. Besides keeping the war with Mexico damped and the Indians quiet, Houston's foreign policy was to continue to seek annexation by the United States. Memucan Hunt, minister to Washington, was ordered to press the matter, and on August 4, 1837, Hunt formally approached the government of the United States. Forsyth, still Secretary of State, made it clear he felt treaty obligations with Mexico, by which Texas had been forever renounced, prevented any such act. Still, a bill was introduced in Congress in early 1838. The matter was brought to a boil, while Van Buren, lacking both Jackson's powers and skills, seemed to hope it would go away. John Quincy Adams made himself Texas's foremost villain by speaking against annexation every morning session of Congress from June 16 to July 7, 1838. Congress finally adjourned without action. Houston, now realizing that the honor of Texas as a sovereign nation was at stake, ordered Dr. Anson Jones, Hunt's successor, formally to withdraw the petition of annexation. This was done, ratified by the Texas Congress, and the matter died. This rejection, meanwhile, built an increasingly powerful anti-American party in Texas, now headed by Mirabeau B. Lamar. Lamar began to talk of Texas building its own empire in the West, if need be, in enmity and opposition to the United States. There were discussions among ambitious, burning-eyed men along the Brazos. If the United States was going to let the slavery question halted at the Sabine, then the far Pacific might fall to another, more vigorous American republic rising in the West. Sam Houston despised this talk. But under the Constitution, he could not succeed himself, nor could he find any Texas politician of sufficient stature to oppose Lamar. Houston's choice to succeed himself in the election of 1838 was Peter Grayson, but Grayson committed suicide before Election Day. Lamar ran on a platform of Texan greatness and future glory. He was elected president almost unanimously and carried the Congress along with him. There were no true political parties in Texas, but the old division between the conservative planters, the Peace Party, and the more warlike radicals, the War Party, continued. Houston had selected his cabinet to bridge the split, with Austin, a conservative, as Secretary of State, and Smith, a radical, his Secretary of the Treasury. But Austin died in December 1836, worn out at the age of 43. This left Houston supported by almost no one of stature. The planter group in Texas was far less interested in national politics, on the whole, than the adventurous lawyers pouring in from the United States. The radical or expansionist group increased daily. Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar was inaugurated as President of Texas in December 1838. In his first speech, he revealed a new policy. No more of Houston's penny pinching and conservative caution. No more of Houston's wheedling after the United States. Lamar inherited a basically unstable situation, increasingly restive Indians on the edges of Anglo-Texas, a smoldering hostile Mexico that refused to end hostilities to the south. Houston had let these problems hang fire, trying to avoid further bloodshed with Mexico and making promises to the Indians he could not keep. His assumption and hope was that when Texas fulfilled its destiny as he saw it and became part of the United States, Washington, not the straggling bankrupt republic between the Brazos and the Colorado, would deal with the Indians and Mexico. In contrast, Lamar considered his own programs much more realistic. They were, in simplest terms, based on the idea that Texas had to fend for itself. He felt that the Mexican government should be given a full chance to negotiate a boundary and a peace with Texas, and if it did not, then the Mexicans should be brought to their senses by knocking them to their knees. The Indians Lamar considered merely trespassing vermin on Texas soil. Because of his outright hostility to Indians, Lamar has been often harshly regarded by American historians. But Lamar invented nothing. The notion that Indians were tenants at will, without inherent title to American soil, and that white men might dispossess them without formal legal action, was already embedded in American thought and practice. They were policies that already had acquired the legitimacy of 200 years. Lamar, with the full agreement of his Secretary of War, Albert Sidney Johnston, and Indian Commissioner, Bonnell, merely enunciated them without hypocrisy. It had been established again and again in American history that the government had no powers to prevent white encroachment on Indian lands, and if the Indians resisted, the government owed the settlers protection. Sam Houston was one of the few great Americans who tried, not to give the Amerinds a reservation or treaty lands, but a legal title to their soil under Anglo-Saxon common law. The attitudes of the majority of Texans who violently opposed this were essentially no different from the attitudes of the men who earlier conquered Massachusetts. Many of the people who denounced Mirabeau Lamar stood on ground where the bones of their forefathers' Indian victims had long moldered. Only time had given that conquest its legitimacy. "If peace can be obtained only by the sword, let the sword do its work," Lamar stated in his inaugural address to thunderous applause. It was an American philosophy that neither began nor ended with Texas's President Lamar. Lamar advocated pressure against the Mexicans, war against the Indians, and sometimes overlooked because it was not implemented, a policy of education and development within the state. Lamar did not look to Washington, and if his programs were impossibly ambitious, he caught a part of every Texan's heart. Here, in the third year of the Republic, Texas history took its essential 19th century pattern, and it also began to fragment. It could no longer be followed as a steady stream. The pattern of immigration into and consolidation of Anglo-Texas continued, but meanwhile Anglo-Texas began to expand along a genuine frontier of war against the Indian West and against the Mexican South. Virtually all Texan historians have seen Texas history in terms of a long, three-cornered conflict. The folkloric historians, such as Walter Prescott Webb, have seen this most clearly of all. Anglo-Texas, marching out of its mild, rich soil Brazos bottoms and southern watered forests, was at continual war with a hostile civilization in the savannas of the South, in savage conflict with the most formidable Amerinds Americans had yet faced. Finally, though not least, locked in an endless struggle against a rough and arid and blazing land such as no Anglo-American had tried to settle before. Each mile toward the Rio Grande, each step up the endless rocky plateaus, Texans left their blood, bones, and blasted dreams. Similar dramas were enacted in other parts of America, but nowhere else was the fight so vicious, nor did it last so long. In every other state, the true frontier was ephemeral. In most, there were water and wood, and the dangerous Amerinds were removed before real settlement began. Even the brutal Kentucky frontier was of short duration, though it put a lasting mark on the men who continued westward. The savage years lasted hardly a decade. What was called the frontier years was really a period of settlement and development, cutting the country down to size, implanting American law and civilization. In Texas, the slow, steady advance of the farmer and the homesteader struck up against a land where the Amerinds rode horseback and the rain ran out. Here, for 2 full generations, the frontier wavered, now forward, now back, locked in bitter battle. Equally dangerous Amerinds were engaged in distant areas, such as the Dakotas and Arizona, but there was one enormous difference. No Americans farmed or took their families by the thousands into those territories until the army had pacified or driven the Indians out. In Texas, solely, was there a clash of cultures between the English and Spanish-speaking peoples in which Texas enhanced the consciousness of race. In Texas, in the 1830s and 1840s, when the great bulk of the American people were still east of the Mississippi, the Anglo-American Far West began. Here, Americans first adapted to a new land and eventually carried newly learned values, whether toward Mexicans or toward cattle, to New Mexico and other states. Here, the Anglo-Celt vanguard fought some of its greatest battles and formed its last great enclave, with its value system adapted to a broader frontier, but otherwise intact. The human hallmarks of most true frontiers, the armed society with its almost theatrical codes and courtesies, its incipient feudalism, its touchy independence and determined self-reliance, its, exaggerated as it seemed to more crowded cultures, individual self-importance, and its tribal territoriality, not only flourished but became a way of life. The Texans came closest to creating, in America, not a society, but a people, like the peoples who had come before them. It was always a mistake to ascribe the notorious Texas chauvinism, so misunderstood and laughed at in other parts of America, to the brief 10-year flying of the Lone Star flag. Neither the Republic, nor the Confederacy, nor even the Union totally captured the 19th century Texas mind. Governments came and went, some hindered, some helped. But Texan patriotism was never based on concepts of government or on ideas. It grew out of the terrible struggle for the land. Significantly, Hispanic and European observers have continually called the true Texan, the descendant and inheritor of the frontier experience, the most European or territorial of Americans. The Texan's attitudes, his inherent chauvinism, and the seeds of his belligerence sprouted from his conscious effort to take and hold his land. It was the reaction of essentially civilized men and women thrown into new and harsh conditions, beset by enemies they despised. The closest 20th century counterpart is the state of Israel, born in blood in another primordial land. The territoriality of Texans, the feeling for place and tribe, and the attitudes this engendered have sometimes been misinterpreted by other Americans, probably for psychological reasons. The Texans in the 19th century did not create a usable past. or one that buttressed 20th century American mainstream thought. The Texans emerged with a blood memory, in the Texan writer Catherine Ann Porter's memorable phrase, "The ceremonial flying of 6 flags, Spanish, French, Mexican, Texan, Confederate, and American, over modern Texas, so puzzling the visitors, is an almost conscious symbolism. Flags change. The land remains." If the American Manhattanite has almost forgotten he lives on soil, has shed his history, and is shaped more by social pressures than a sense of territory, the Texan can never, even in his cities, forget or be free of the brooding immensity of his land. His national myths were more influenced by the Alamo and the burden of a century of a wild frontier than concepts conceived at Philadelphia. Tragically, next to memories of the struggle for freedom from Mexico are the smoldering memories of a long and losing struggle against the encroachments of cultures from other regions of the United States. If the Texan became the most European of Americans, it was because in his history he has been both a conscious conqueror and a member of a vanquished race. Under President Lamar, a series of wars or campaigns began against the Indians. Militia, regular Texas Army forces, and local bands called ranging companies were employed. In one campaign in East Texas, more than 1,000 soldiers were mobilized. Texas put heavy pressure upon the Penetecas, or Southern Comanches, in the San Antonio region, but the main blow fell against the border Indians, who still occupied large fringes of territory between the Comanches and the whites. These were broken, dominated, and forced back. Above all, the Cherokees and several other immigrant tribes who had moved into East Texas after being dispossessed in the United States were attacked and driven either into Oklahoma or Arkansas. The campaigns against the Comanches were justifiable, for Comanches had begun raiding Anglo-Texan settlements. The moves against the inoffensive Cherokees, however, were more in the nature of a land grab. The mass evictions of the remaining agricultural Indians in East Texas were carried out for the same reasons, and with the same injustice as they had been done under the Jackson administration to the east. In these operations, a large number of whites and many more Indians were killed. The warfare was bitter, bloody, and brutal all along the borders of Anglo-Texas. However, these wars expelled virtually all the immigrant Indians from the United States and opened up all East Texas to white settlement. They pushed the Comanches back in the area north of Behar and bought a period of peace along the frontier. As the historian Richardson wrote, the justice of Lamar's campaigns may be questioned, but their effectiveness is beyond dispute. These Indian wars cost the Texas Treasury $2,500,000, however, and Lamar, like Houston, was unable to negotiate any respectable loan. Lamar proposed to found a Bank of Texas, but there was no money to fund it. More and more paper money was printed, more than $3 million in redback notes, which soon fell to around a dime on the dollar. Lamar did try to make peace with Mexico. At this time, France was blockading Mexican ports in an attempt to collect the claims of French citizens, and the old Federalist-Centralist quarrel caused civil strife in several Mexican states. But Lamar's offer of $5 million for recognition and acceptance of the Rio Grande boundary was not accepted. Mexico, however, kept negotiations alive during 1839 and 1840 for one reason. The small Texas Navy under Edwin Moore was now at sea and a threat to Mexican commerce. Great Britain then agreed to mediate between the two powers and signed a treaty with Texas to that effect. But despite British pressure on Mexico, Mexico refused to negotiate seriously. James Webb, the Texas emissary, was not even received. At this point, in 1841, Lamar resolved to reopen the war. Lamar signed an alliance with the Mexican state of Yucatan, which was for some months engaged in a civil war with the supreme government. This conflict dribbled away as Yucatan rejoined Mexico, but now hostilities had been taken up again. Lamar, who talked openly of a Republic of Texas that reached to the Pacific Ocean, dispatched an expedition to the upper Rio Grande to take possession of Santa Fe. There was a considerable belief in Texas that the Mexican inhabitants of New Mexico would welcome it. Instead, this expedition, after marching across 1,300 miles of burning plains, suffering Indian attacks, hunger, thirst, and exhaustion, was easily captured by the Mexican army when it reached New Mexico. The survivors of the 300-odd soldiers who left Texas were brutally chained and marched deep into Mexico. They were held in the Mexican fortress of Perote until April 1842. The Spanish had learned some centuries earlier that troops could not march at will across the high plains. Now, the Texans, who had never explored the region, had to learn their own lessons, painfully. The province of New Mexico was weak enough. The Texas government had claimed everything east of the Rio Grande, but the territory was effectively beyond reach. It was also easier in the South to declare the war reopened with Mexico than to carry the war to it. Lamar's influence defeated a plan to settle 8,000 French colonists along the Rio Grande in the South. These people were to be imported to form a buffer, much as Mexicans had imported Americans to place a wall between themselves and the Indians. The scheme, however, would have created a semi-autonomous French state within lands claimed by Texas. Sam Houston favored it, but Lamar, perhaps clearer-sighted, felt the all-important unity of Anglo-Texas would be breached. Meanwhile, the declared hostilities languished, since there were no Texans in contact with, or within 300 miles of, the southern Rio Grande. Lamar's second great success, besides quelling the Indians, was that his exercise of Texan sovereignty secured some foreign recognition. During Houston's administration, Great Britain failed to acknowledge Texas for 3 reasons. Texas was proclaimed Negro slave territory, and sentiment in Britain was opposed to slavery. British interests had heavy investments in Mexico, which Lord Palmerston hesitated to alienate. And finally, the British government supposed Texas would soon enter the United States. Ironically, Lamar's aggressions and the simultaneous withdrawal of the annexation petition quickened European interest and strengthened the acceptance of Texas sovereignty. Lamar was acting like the ruler of an Anglo-Saxon republic, as both the French and British governments understood one. In 1839, assisted by French exasperation with Mexican debts, Texas signed a treaty of recognition with France. In 1840, a treaty with the Netherlands followed. Late the same year, Palmerston became convinced Texas might be here to stay. 3 British-Texas treaties were signed: recognition, commerce, and navigation, and as a Texas concession, a convention permitting the Royal Navy to suppress slave running on the Texas coast. This last was a sop to British anti-slavery opinion. Very few blacks were being brought in by sea. They were being purchased or imported from the United States. At the close of Lamar's presidency, Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands had recognized or had commercial treaties with the Republic of Texas. None of these nations, however, was willing to grant a loan to Mirabeau Lamar. The capital of Texas had been moved to the town of Houston, then just being laid out in the last days of 1836. But Houston provided no better site than the old Columbia. In 1839, a commission appointed to study the question of a new site selected a location on the Colorado, almost in the center of the claimed territory of the country. Lamar moved his government to this place, which was named Austin. By 1840, this new capital held almost 900 people, but the location, whatever the long-term political implications, had great disadvantages. Austin lay far beyond the frontier of Anglo settlement, 70-odd miles north of San Antonio, and it was on the edge of Comanche country. The combination of being remote from Anglo-Texas and near the Indians made many members of the Texas government unwilling even to travel there. They lacked the president's compulsion to look and go west. As Lamar neared the end of his term, in 1841, his expenditures and wars had revived the old Peace Party, the conservative planter class. Their candidate was Sam Houston, who was now remarried, a member of the Baptist Church, and a firm advocate of governmental economy in all things. The campaign, in Texas style, however, was fought not on ideology, but on the issues of which candidate was the greatest coward, drunkard, or public thief. On these terms, the War Party candidate, the former President David G. Burnett, was defeated easily by the hero of San Jacinto, who, after an interim, could legally be president again. Edward Burleson, another war hero, was elected vice president on an independent ticket. President Houston brought a planter Congress in with him, and this 6th Texas Congress turned off the public tap. In a series of acts, dozens of offices were abolished, salaries of officials were reduced to mere honoraria, the Army was reduced to a few companies of Rangers, and the Texas Navy, an expensive proposition, was ordered sold. Commodore Moore, who protested the ignominious auction of the 4 ships that had served Texas so well, both in war and diplomacy, was first declared a pirate and then dishonorably discharged by President Houston. However, the Navy was never sold. The citizens of Galveston, who had fallen in love with the Lone Star flag on the high seas, held mass meetings. When the ships put into port, citizens threw armed guards around them, and the orders of the Republic could only have been carried out with bloodshed. For 3 years, this impasse remained. When Texas, in 1845, became a state, the Lone Star ensign was replaced by the Stars and Stripes. The Navy was transferred intact to the service of the United States. Houston's Congress repealed all Lamar's currency and banking laws. The issuance of new money was tightly controlled. Only about $200,000 was printed in exchequer bills. In his second 3-year term, Houston spent less than $600,000, and government accounts began to resemble those of a retail store. Thus, in some measure, passed the glory of Lamar's republic. Houston, if he had not been the undeniable hero of San Jacinto, would have been branded as an Indian lover. He had tried to save the Cherokees, and he had a generic sympathy with all Indians. In return, most tribes respected Houston. He was able to sign treaties with the Wacos, Tawakenes, and Southern Comanches. These tribes now continued to provide a buffer between the settlers and the more warlike bands on the Great Plains, and for some years Indian warfare ceased. Houston's success here, however, was caused more by the fact that white settlement had not yet filled the vacuum Lamar's campaigns had made than by any Texan acceptance of Indian rights. Houston's most serious war was a feud that broke out in East Texas between newcomers and early squatters near the old neutral ground. This region dissolved in lawlessness and anarchy. After several notorious public shootings and murders between the regulators and moderators, names carried all the way from Appalachia, Houston turned out the militia and put the Republic back in control. Many private feuds growing out of these times went on. Lasting feuds by 1844 had become a feature of Texas life. They were to mar the politics of the state throughout the century. However, Mirabeau Lamar had succeeded at last in arousing Mexico, and Houston inherited the minor whirlwind the Bonaparte of Texas had stirred up. Santa Anna had bided his time and was again president of Mexico. Fired by the belief that Mexico, to keep any international belief in its sovereignty over Texas and to prevent further raids like the one on Santa Fe, had to do something, Santa Anna sent an expedition north across the Rio Grande in the spring of 1842. This was not an attempt to reconquer Texas. It was a show of force. The Mexican army easily captured San Antonio, Refugio, and Goliad, this time unopposed. The new invasion recreated the scenes of the runaway scrape in these outermost parts of what was then called West Texas. Houston moved the government from Austin to his namesake, Houston, but citizens of Austin prevented removal of the archives, in a farce that came to be called the Archive War. The Mexicans retired south after only a few days. No damage was done, but the Texas militia swarmed again toward San Antonio. However, Sam Houston had no intention of reliving the grim and deadly days of '36. He did send agents to the United States to seek assistance. This fitted with his long-range plans, but he vigorously vetoed his Congress's declaration of war on the grounds that the financial measures provided to support it were inadequate. Santa Anna refused to let the war die. Again, in September 1842, General Adrian Wall, with 1,000 men, re-entered San Antonio. Wall caught the Texas District Court in session, and this time he took 67 Texans prisoners. These included all male Anglo citizens in the town. Again, however, the Mexicans only remained a few days, then retreated with their captives. 2 brushes were fought with Texas militia. In one fight, at the Salado, Matthew Caldwell and John C. Hayes shot up the Mexicans badly in a brushy bottom, forcing Wall to back off with about 100 dead. Wall's force caught another group of Texans, about 50 men under Captain Dawson, in the open. In this battle, the Mexicans prudently remained beyond rifle range and killed all but 15 of Dawson's force with artillery fire. The survivors were added to the bag taken at San Antonio. Houston was now forced to call for volunteers. He ordered a descent upon the Rio Grande. Houston still did not intend to make war, but he had to do something to allay public opinion. By November 1842, 750 men were assembled in San Antonio. This army marched to Laredo, north of the Rio Grande, but a Mexican town, and captured it on December 8th. Here, some of the men left the army and went home. Somervell, the Texan general, marched south along the river for a few miles as a demonstration, then ordered the army back to Gonzales. He was working under Houston's orders, and even the army suspected he did not intend to make war. Some 300 men were infuriated by this retreat and refused to go. They elected a new colonel, Fisher, and crossed the border, taking the town of Mir. Here, after a desperate battle, the force was rounded up by the Mexican general Ampudia on December 26th. The captives were started for Mexico City. They tried a break, and in retaliation, after the typical lottery, they were decimated. 1 man in 10 was shot. Those left were incarcerated in Perote prison, with the survivors of the expedition to Santa Fe. After some months, they were released, largely due to the efforts of Waddy Thompson, Texas's old friend in the U.S. Congress, who was now U.S. Minister to Mexico. Another expedition, authorized by Houston, under Snively, attempted to raid the commerce passing between Missouri and Santa Fe. This march provoked a serious incident with the United States. The Mexican mule trains were guarded by United States troops on soil claimed both by the Republic of Texas and the United States. Although the attack did take place on Texas soil, Snively's men were captured and disarmed by the United States Army and sent ingloriously home. On Houston's protest, reimbursement for the arms was made. During these months, Houston consistently attempted to damp the war. He refused to respond to public demands to attack Mexico. There was no doubt that world opinion, everywhere except in South America and the United States Northeast, favored Texas. But Houston used this favorable opinion primarily for propaganda purposes. He asked Britain and France to require of Mexico either the recognition of the independence of Texas or to make war upon her, according to the rules established and universally recognized by civilized nations. Santa Anna's decimation of Texas pirates backfired, like his executions at Goliad. Under some pressure from abroad, Santa Anna offered Texas a peace treaty in return for the recognition of inherent Mexican sovereignty. Houston might have taken this had his goal been anything less than union with the United States. Houston realized that this would block annexation for years, if not forever. Santa Anna, of course, was seeking 2 things: a way to satisfy Mexican notions of national honor, and at the same time, without recovering Texas, to keep the United States from arriving on the Rio Grande. Houston wisely did not reject the overture, but used it to proclaim a truce on June 14, 1843. Mexico and Texas negotiated with British mediation. These talks solved nothing, but they did give an excuse for a general armistice, not recognition or peace, which went into effect in early 1844. Houston was stalling because the annexation question had risen again. The great irony of these years was that while Houston never wanted anything but annexation and worked both directly and deviously for it, it was actually Mirabeau Lamar who knocked open the door. The Texas Congress had claimed not only the Rio Grande, but passed a resolution claiming the Californias as Texas soil. This was not so ridiculous as it sounded, since the western boundaries of Texas were as yet undefined by international or any other kind of law. The Republic, on fighting free of Mexico, was in a position to claim anything outside of U.S. territory in the West it could take or hold. Houston vetoed the California's bill, but it was repassed over his veto. Lamar's unsuccessful Santa Fe expedition, not Houston's moderation, had aroused new interest in the United States. The public was titillated by the journal of an American newspaperman who joined it for a vacation. The sufferings of the expedition and the brutalities of the Mexicans were recounted in heroic terms. In Washington, where there was already growing interest in the Pacific coast, and which was involved in a dispute with Great Britain over Oregon, the government was chilled by the concept of an aggressive Texas expanding west. It was one thing to write off the Brazos slave country. It was something else to relinquish the entire Southwest from sea to sea. Jackson and many other far-seeing men already felt the United States must acquire California and Oregon and thus be forever strategically secure in the hemisphere. Further, Lamar's vigorous assertion of sovereignty, carrying the flag west and showing it with the Texas Navy on the high seas, gained him the great power recognition of Britain and France. This roused new American fears. If Texas lacked the power to dominate the American West, its commercial treaties with Great Britain seemed to allow British influence its return. Captain Charles Elliot, the British chargé d'affaires, did not trust Sam Houston and suspected he was being used as a cat's paw, but still the British worked to gain influence where they could. This fear of British penetration, a Texas allied with Great Britain disputing possession of the far west, created certain nightmares, caused President Tyler to swallow legality and open negotiations for annexation on October 16, 1843. Mexico had still not surrendered Texas, and the United States was still bound by treaty obligations, but it simply could not afford to leave a vacuum for British power to fill. Houston cannily now played coy. He refused to let negotiations proceed until he had the assurance of American protection. He got this. There was a growing feeling in many Washington quarters that strategic considerations overrode domestic politics, or even the danger of war with Mexico. On April 12, 1844, the Texans Isaac Van Zandt and J. Pinckney Henderson signed a treaty of annexation with John C. Calhoun, by which Texas would become a territory of the United States. The U.S. Senate, however, lacked the Secretary of State's concern for dominant strategy. On June 8, the Senate rejected the treaty through a strange alliance of anti-slavery men and Southerners who demanded full statehood for Texas now. Another factor in this defeat was the imminence of the national elections. Few senators were sure of public opinion on Texas. This put the question squarely into the presidential campaign, where two of the leading contenders, Henry Clay and Martin Van Buren, hoped it would never appear. Clay, the Whig, could not support annexation. He would lose too many Whig votes in the North. Van Buren, trying for a comeback in the presidency, chose wrong and cut his political throat. The leading Democrat contender for the nomination, he tried to make a deal with Clay on Texas to keep it out of the campaign. This lost him Jacksonian support. Andrew Jackson, who was still a power, and the Western expansionists threw their support to a virtual unknown, James Knox Polk of Tennessee. Polk was a friend of Sam Houston. In fact, he had succeeded to Houston's old seat in the House. He was a Jacksonian through and through, and King Andrew, now rapidly failing, managed his whole campaign. Polk won the Democratic nomination. He went on to assail the quibbling Clay, who probably wanted the presidency far too much. Polk, who never wanted it at all, but took it as part of a plan of dominant Jacksonian policy, attacked on two issues: Texas and Oregon, 54-40 or fight. His running mate, George Dallas of Pennsylvania, backed annexation. There is some evidence the American Anti-Slavery Society overplayed its hand. William Lloyd Garrison roared that all who would sympathize with that pseudo-republic hate liberty and would dethrone God. But 90% of Texans were neither slaves nor slavers, and Houston himself was no friend of that particular institution. The coupling of Oregon, into which New Englanders were moving, with Texas made thousands see the true territorial issue, which was, as Sam Houston said, whether the glory of the United States would culminate too soon. Men such as Jackson, and Sam Houston certainly, were seeing a distant, almost impossible dream: the future world preeminence of the United States. It is almost certain in retrospect that Houston's motives were different from Mirabeau Lamar's only in degree. Sam Houston, as he had promised, never forgot the land of his birth when he made Texas his abiding place. In the campaign of 1844, opinion changed. Even Northern newspapers, which had attacked annexation in the past, now editorialized that annexation was inevitable and that it should be done with grace. Polk won by a narrow popular vote. It was enough, however, to assure that Polk would acquire more territory for the United States than any president, including Jefferson, had ever done before. Tyler read this mandate and placed the annexation issue before the Congress once again. Houston, meanwhile, came to the end of his second administration. This time, he had the satisfaction of seeing his policy vindicated at the polls. The Houston candidate won the presidency in 1844, defeating the war, or Lamar man, Burleson, 7,037 to 5,668. Dr. Anson Jones, Houston's successor, in general was pledged to Houston's goals. His victory was attributed, even by him, to Houston's popularity. Houston had galled Texans mainly on four things: higher tariffs, the movement of the working government from Austin to Houston, the coddling of the Indians, and his failure to secure the release of Texan captives in Mexico. Against these faults, he could claim two accomplishments. He had not involved the Texas planters in a major war. In fact, he had gone out of his way to avoid one. And he had allowed eastern Texas to develop without governmental interference. Lamar's dreams of glory caught the Texas mind, but they also strained the economy beyond endurance. The vote for Dr. Anson Jones and Burleson, who favored Lamar's policies, split dramatically between east and western Texas. The old cotton counties, particularly the country east of the Trinity, went for Jones. The newer western regions of the Republic preferred Burleson. Now, in early 1845, the pendulum shifted. The United States, which had coolly put Texas off for almost a decade, was now almost desperate to annex the Republic. The government was committed to it. A majority of the people were in favor. But with Polk's election, it was Texas's turn to delay and play for the greatest advantage. After consultations among Tyler, President-elect Polk, and Polk's new Congress, a much more liberal annexation bill was presented to Congress. The new terms called for the admission of Texas as a full state, provided it passed its own ordinance before January 1, 1846, the ownership of all public lands in Texas by the state, not the federal government, upon annexation, the permission to divide Texas into 4 more states, with slavery banned north of 36 degrees 30 minutes. A provision was also made that if Texas refused these terms, the president was empowered to adjust them. This bill passed February 26, 1845. Andrew Jackson Donaldson, the U.S. representative in Houston, presented these terms to Jones. A few days later, Polk was inaugurated, and he wrote to Donelson urging no delay. But Jones and his cabinet were now holding high cards and playing for tantalizing stakes. There were important men in Texas who saw not only a chance for a Texan empire stretching to the Pacific, but with gloomy prophecy, the possibility of other southern states seceding from the Union and joining Texas. The British, who had at last tried to move strongly into the Republic, and the French minister, Comte de Saligny, used all their diplomatic skills now to prevent annexation. President Jones and his very able Secretary of State, Dr. Ashbel Smith, the man who had written the Texan White Paper that had brought so much French and British pressure on Santa Anna in 1843, were not much inclined toward a Texan empire. But they did want to avoid offending the two European powers. There had been some promises made that, with annexation, would be impossible to keep. Captain Elliott and Saligny jointly proposed to Jones that nothing be done for 90 days, while France and Britain pressured Mexico into signing a treaty of recognition and peace. Santa Anna had been replaced with General Herrera, and now, at the 11th hour, Herrera was convinced that Mexican intransigence was producing the worst of all worlds, the final loss of Texas, and the planting of the U.S. flag on the Rio Grande. He gave Captain Elliott a signed treaty that recognized Texas's full independence, provided the Republic did not join the United States in May 1845. But it was far too late. The American government had acted first. Smith and Jones proposed to place this treaty before the Texas Congress, which was now called to meet on June 16th, along with the U.S. Treaty of Annexation. But Jones quickly realized that Texan sentiment for annexation was too strong now. The people had overwhelmingly shown acceptance of the liberal American offer. Virtually all the propertied people in Texas favored union. Annexation offered military protection from both Mexico and the Indians, U.S. postal and other services, and a sound currency and financial system. The retention of public lands by the state and the American acceptance of the Rio Grande boundary pacified the land-hungry belligerent western counties. Texans were, as the Union was then construed, surrendering nothing and gaining much. They already paid high customs fees and tariffs. This was the only real source of income for the Republic, and in those days the federal government collected no taxes and left virtually all internal regulation to the states. Jones did not wait for his Congress to convene. He called for a general convention to be elected at once, to meet July 4th. When the Texas Congress met at Washington on the Brazos, it rejected the Mexican treaty and recommended the American treaty be approved. The convention that assembled a few days later adopted the U.S. offer with only one dissenting vote and began immediate work on a state constitution. This constitution embodied most of the forms of the old republic and also borrowed heavily from the state constitution of Louisiana. The Constituent Assembly that wrote it included an unusual number of able men: T.J. Rusk, J. Pinckney Henderson, Isaac Van Zandt, R.E.B. Baylor, N.H. Darnell, Hiram Runnels, and Jose Antonio Navarro of San Antonio. Navarro was the only member born in Texas. 18 writers came from Tennessee, 8 from Virginia. Georgia furnished 7, Kentucky 6, and North Carolina 5. Among these men were scions of several distinguished American families, several former members of Congress, a Chief Justice of Alabama, and a former Mississippi governor. The Constitution provided for a popularly elected governor with a term of 2 years. Other high officials were to be appointed, though 5 years later this was changed, and the Attorney General, Comptroller, and Treasurer were to be elected. The legislature met biennially. Specific Texas provisions, which became fundamental Texas law, were continued. The anti-clerical provision that no minister of the gospel could serve in the legislature, the guarantee of separate property rights for married women, exemption from foreclosure of private homesteads, and anti-corporation law. The planters of Texas already hated soulless corporations. Only a two-thirds vote of the Texas House could create a private corporation, and no bank under any circumstances might incorporate. The Constitution was approved, along with annexation, by a vote of approximately 4,000 to 200 on October 13, 1845. It was immediately accepted as adequate by the Congress of the United States. On December 29, 1845, Polk signed the act that merged the Lone Star into many, and in a brief ceremony on February 19, 1846, the Texas flag fluttered down. The last president of the Republic handed over his authority to the new governor, Pinckney Henderson. Sam Houston and Tom Rusk were new United States senators, and a United States Army already stood on Texas soil. As Ensign Jones concluded his farewell address, the Republic of Texas was no more. Chapter 16. The Lone Star